As we look at the Sermon on the Mount and our purpose, we come across two metaphors that are the key to unlocking it: salt and light. And in these metaphors, we find a beautiful truth. So here is the Sermon on the Mount and our role in the covenant. When it comes to the metaphors of salt and light, and trying to understand them in the Sermon on the Mount, we actually run into a bit of a roadblock because there's so many different things that they can be about. Salt, for example, could be about taste, but it could also be about preserving food. It could also be about being used as a purifying agent. And light, well, light has so many uses in the Old Testament. Where do we start? Light can be used for revelation, for instruction, for law, for God's presence. It's even used for righteousness. Maybe that's it. Perhaps the best way to look at this, as the two metaphors are so closely linked, is where do the metaphors find overlap in meaning? Where does salt and light find overlap in meaning? Perhaps the best way to deal with this problem is to ask, where do salt and light share some sort of common understanding? And if you were to spend time studying, you'd find they have an overlap in the meaning of covenant. Now, what is a covenant? A covenant is quite simply an agreement between two parties. So when we talk about the covenant, we're talking about the agreement between God and his people. And salt was actually used in part of the rituals for solidifying a covenant between two parties. You can read about it in the Old Testament. And as for light, well, that's used a lot in the prophets when they're talking about the coming Messiah and the covenant that he will build. In fact, a really good place to see how covenant and light tie together is in the prophet Isaiah. There's a lot of references to light there, and there's this idea of a light to the nations. And it ties in with covenant like this. This is Isaiah 42, verse 6, and it reads like this: I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. So we see in this verse how this idea of covenant and a light to the nations are tied together. God's covenant was that God's people would be a light. So in these images of salt and light, we find covenant as the understanding. There's an expression of this purpose we're supposed to have is bound up with our covenant as the people of God. In fact, Matthew very heavily uses Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 in his work. And the Sermon on the Mount is no different. It's full of allusions to Isaiah and chapters 40 through 66 and the prophecies of the Messiah. And these ideas of salt and light to the nations in Isaiah really root this whole text in that salvation history context I keep going on about. So yes, flourishing is this virtue, wisdom idea, but it's really being rooted in the biblical story. We have a purpose. As agents of the covenant found in Jesus, as agents of the flourishing found in the kingdom of God, our purpose is rooted in the covenant we find in Jesus. This has already been foreshown to us back at the end of the Beatitudes. The prophets who were persecuted for their righteousness and have reward. And here we find prophetic allusions to the covenant that is being made. The invitation to flourish. brings with it a purpose for us to be the heralds of God's new covenant, bound up in Jesus. Heralds that flourishing is possible. Heralds that righteousness can be pursued. Heralds that the kingdom of God can be entered into. When we step forward into flourishing, we also step forward into that wonderful covenant with God and find a purpose that is rooted in covenant.